In Jennifer Egan's 2006 novel, The Keep, a recovering bond trader renovating a Middle European castle tries to explain to his visiting cousin what he hopes to get out of it. Think about medieval times, he says. People were constantly seeing ghosts, having visions. They thought Christ was sitting with them at the dinner table. They thought angels and devils were flying around. We don't see those things anymore. Why? Was all that stuff happening before and then it stopped? Unlikely. Was everyone nuts in medieval times? Doubtful. But their imaginations were more active. Their inner lives were rich and weird, and my mission is to bring some of that back. You dive in and bang, your imagination is released. It's yours again. Not Hollywood's, not the networks or Lifetime TV or Vanity Fair or whatever crap video game you're addicted to. You make it up. You tell the story, and then you're free. In the last week, rereading Jennifer Egan's visionary body of work in preparation for tonight, I've come to think of this passage as a kind of précis of the pleasures Egan rediscovers in fiction. Make no mistake, this writer is a bloodhound for fact. She's as accomplished a journalist as a novelist, and even in fiction, she can tell you how a 1940s diving suit works, how a hit single gets marketed, how to carve a prison shank, or reconstruct a broken face, how a methadone high feels, and how to play Dungeons and Dragons while waiting for it to kick in. But in an age consecrated to information, Egan is always lifting off the grid to imagine a wider view of other lives, other possible futures, other ways of telling a story. She makes us see ghosts, see salvation at the dinner table, think angels and devils are flying around, and so helps us imagine we're free. Her work has won her a large and ardent readership, a kind of semi-permanent encampment in bestsellerdom, and numerous awards, including the Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction for Manhattan Beach, the National Book Critics Circle Award and Pulitzer Prize, both for a visit from the Goon Squad, which I think her publisher aptly calls beloved. In her new novel, The Candy House, a sibling of sorts, Egan imagines something like The Day After Tomorrow, a world where the analog nostalgia for vinyl's warm crackle has given way to the futurist rush to upload our minds and memories to the internet via an innovation called Own Your Unconscious. In a brilliant roundelay of linked stories, this desire to merge with the lives of others starts to look awfully lot like a longing to find a way to more deeply inhabit our own rich, weird inner selves. And it is our luck that Jennifer Egan is with us tonight and is planning to read to us a bit from the Candy House before we dive into discussion and questions from the audience.
Thank you. I think that is officially my favorite introduction ever. So thank you very much, Garth. I'm going to try to live up to that for the rest of my career. I'm going to read just the beginning of a chapter called The Mystery of Our Mother. Long ago, she told us, when we were just a hope in her heart, or not even that, because she never wanted children, or thought she didn't, a higher power touched our mother's head and said, "Stop what you're doing. 2 little girls are waiting to be born, and you need to have them right away because the world is desperate for their brightness." So she stopped studying anthropology, which she really did love and maybe would study again someday when you're all grown up and don't need me anymore. We'll always need you. I'll always need you too, that's for sure. I'll try not to drive you crazy with my mommy needs. Till the end. Well, I stopped going to anthropology school and I married your daddy and we brought you into the world. And here you are. It all worked out perfectly. Where is Daddy? You'll see him next week. He's taking you to ballet. Last time he never came. I'll be here, just in case. He can't make a bun. That's not important, honey. Before ballet? Don't whine, sweetie. He threw Tam Tam out the window of the car. He said she was moth-eaten. That was unfortunate. How could you marry him? Love is a mystery. Does Daddy love you? He loves you. That's what matters. He said we were young spendthrifts. Did he now? He said, can we not talk about what he said? We're just telling you. I don't need to be told. I know your father very well. How did she endure these conversations? Of course, our father didn't love her any more than she loved him. He was 15 years older than our mother, twice divorced when they met, with 4 kids, 2 by each ex-wife. How's that for a rotten prospective husband? But he was charming, a famous record producer, and above all, we later surmised, he wouldn't take no for an answer. Why he wanted our mother to say yes is another mystery. They had nothing in common beyond a taste for beauty, his, and beauty, hers. But she never lived by her beauty. She was the kind of mom who rarely wore makeup, who let her hair grow wild and didn't bother to shower on Sunday, her day off from the travel agency where she went to work after our father stranded her without any money to raise us. The sun-gnawed apartment complex where we lived with our mother, starting as toddlers in the late 1970s, the first home we remember, seemed to be populated entirely by females, aging B-movie actresses who took deliveries of Gallo wine in gallon bottles, and aspiring starlets whose much older boyfriends had white stripes on their ring fingers. The apartments surrounded a garden containing a single gargantuan palm tree, either a relic of some agricultural prehistory of that patch of land or a decorative feature that had bloated grotesquely out of scale with the modest complex it was decorating. The bedroom we shared with our mother faced a canopy of fronds like the fingers of a dozen hands. Even on sunny days, it made a sound like rain. On Sunday mornings, we climbed into our mother's bed to be the monster, which meant lying with our chests on top of hers so that all of us could feel our 3 beating hearts. Our hair tangled with her hair, and our breath melted into hers until we were one creature lying under the moving, whispering hands of another creature, the palm tree. The tree had a name, we told our mother, Herbert. What if it's a girl tree? A girl can be Herbert. Our mother propped herself on one elbow and studied us. There aren't a lot of men around here, are there? Do you wish you saw more of your daddy? No. He loves you very much. We love you. You can love us both, you know. No, we can't. Our parents' marriage collapsed when a San Francisco high school student washed up on their Malibu doorstep, having run away from home and hitchhiked south after our father seduced her on a business trip. We were 3 and 4 years old. Our father managed on paper to appear penniless. He left our mother with nothing but us, which by his calculation probably meant less than nothing. But for our mother, who had little else, we were infinite. She loved us infinitely in return and gave us that rare thing, a happy childhood. She never told us why she'd left our father. Much later, he did. On the occasions when our father showed up to take us to ballet, we walked grimly down the cracked outdoor steps from our second-story apartment to one of his many cars. Hello, girls. One of you want to ride in front? We shook our heads. It wasn't safe. Everyone knew that except him. How about something to eat? We've got time before your class. We don't eat before ballet. I can't do anything right with you two, can I? We shook our heads. And he laughed and began to drive. But when he pulled up in front of the strip mall where the ballet studio was, he turned around and peered at us in the back seat. I'm your father. You understand that, don't you? We nodded in stony unison. That's not nothing. That means something. He searched our cold eyes. You don't like me. Why? It was not a rhetorical question. He was curious, awaiting a reply. We looked at our father closely for perhaps the first time, his weathered surfer's tan and longish blonde hair, his crooked front teeth. He watched us watch him, and then he laughed. How would you know? You're just 2 little kids. One day, after ballet, our father told us that we weren't going straight home. We glowered. Does Mommy know? Of course your mother knows. What do you think I am, a kidnapper? He drove grimly, our lack of enthusiasm clearly needling him. We played rock, paper, scissors in the back seat and pretended he wasn't there. Hey, try looking around for a change. We were driving along a cliff, the ocean shivering enormously below. It seemed a different world from the parched, flat one we inhabited with our mother, full of glittering cars and broiling asphalt lots. Eventually, we descended the cliff and pulled into the driveway of a house with tiled roofs and magenta flowers overflowing its walls. There were no other houses around it. Rock and roll crashed from inside the house, but our father walked us straight past it to a beach whose fine white sand was different from Venice Beach, where our mother often took us on Sunday afternoons. Where are the people? It's a private beach. We're the only ones who can be here. Is it yours? Yes, it's mine. Go ahead, run around, have some fun. We stood watching him. Come on, play. When we failed to move, he said, I've never seen a pair of kids who wouldn't play. It's your beach. I'm your father. My beach is your beach. We like beaches with people. You're very tough, you two. Does your mother ever tell you that? We shook our heads. Ah, so I'm seeing the real you, plural. No, she is. She may think so, but I know better. I'm going to stop there.
So there's so much I want to ask you about this book because there's so much in there to ask about. But I thought I'd start with this. There's a moment in the first section where a character named Bix, I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, but I'm from Louisiana, so we'd say Bouton. Bix Bouton, a supporting character from Goon Squad, who's now a kind of tech magnate, visionary guy, is walking around looking for his next big idea. And there's a sentence, he'd long been aware of a suggestive edge in the middle distance of his mental landscape, beyond which his next vision lay in wait. But whenever he tried to peek beyond the edge, his mind went white. And I thought I detected a little bit of the novelist in between projects in that line. I could be wrong, but in any case, I'm wondering if you could kind of tell us a bit about where you started to peek beyond the edge of Manhattan Beach, which was the last book, and to realize you were going to write this one.
Well, in a way, this book a little bit predated Manhattan Beach in that I was actually working on one chapter of this book while on my book tour for A Visit from the Goon Squad. So in a way, I mean, Goon Squad is very open-ended in the sense that every chapter is about a different person, so therefore each chapter has its own kind of constellation of other people whose lives could conceivably be explored, and there's a kind of infinitude to it. And so I was already imagining beyond it, even by the time it was published, not in the sense that I thought, oh, I wish I could have, somehow forced this last piece into the book. It felt like that book was done, but it also felt like I was still curious, and curiosity was really the organizing principle and the driving force of the first book. So I was already in it, and then I wrote several chapters by hand in 2012 and 2013 at the same time that I was writing a first draft of Manhattan Beach. And then it became clear that Manhattan Beach was going to require so much research that I couldn't keep doing this at the same time. So I actually put those handwritten drafts in a drawer and then pulled them back out in 2016 and typed them up. And a lot of it was really unworkable, but there was enough there that felt of interest that I decided to stay curious and see where it led.
So just for example, the piece that you just read, the father there is Lou Klein, who will be recognizable to readers of Goon Squad, and then the narrators are Melora and I'm going to lose the other
Lana.
Melora and Lana, who are kind of off to the side in Goon Squad, and then they're stepping forward in this piece. So you get this interesting relation between the two books. But when you said curiosity was an organizing principle for that book, I'm intrigued. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, I mean, so for example, with A Visit from the Goon Squad, I originally thought the timeline would go backwards. So I thought it would be chronological, just not going forward, going backwards, so that instead of the reader asking, wanting to know what's going to happen next, the reader would be asking and having satisfied the question of, okay, what was that earlier thing like? So when I read the material in that order, I realized that it actually was really flat. And that was a terrible discovery because I thought I was almost done. And I suddenly thought, wow, either this is just not very good or I'm getting in my own way somehow. And I realized that the way in which I was getting in my way was through chronology, because the satisfactions of the book were in being curious about something and then seeing it deeply, these kind of radical perspective shifts. And if I forced the reader to wait until I earned something chronologically, that spark of curiosity was often gone by that time, and we might not even remember what that moment of curiosity was. So I realized that it was a book in which chronology was just irrelevant, and that actually curiosity and satisfaction were the organizing principles. And I would say the same of this book. And I knew going in that I didn't even imagine that chronology would be, a deciding factor, because I could just feel that it would at least have that in common with Goon Squad. But even beyond structurally, so often the reason that I end up writing about people or situations in these books is specifically that there's a brief mention of something that seems intriguing, and I want to see it more closely. So I indulge my curiosity by plunging into the middle of it. And if it works, I try to save that same kind of hunger and satisfaction and replicate it for the reader.
So it sounds like you are the kind of writer who doesn't start out with a roadmap and you've marked where the gas stations are and we're going to Disneyland at the end, that you're kind of rolling down the windows and putting on some rock and roll and like seeing where the road wants to go. Is that fair?
Yes. I mean, I would say that my first drafts are very improvisational. I have never done improv, actually. I've never acted and I don't play an instrument. But when I see theater improv, let's say, it feels to me like people doing what I'm doing in my first drafts, which is trying to find together a line of possibility and action that feels alive, and then just push it hard and see how far it can go and in what directions. And that's kind of what I do. I write fiction by hand, and I try to write maybe 5 to 7 pages a day. I can't read it very well. My handwriting's really a mess, and
I've got that too. It's great. It's wonderful.
Great. It's fantastic. If I'm looking at it on a screen, I'm immediately trying to go backwards and fix it, but I just hurtle forward, and my goal is to be surprised. And I want to, I still remember writing these early scenes of the little girls with their father and discovering certain things about the way the story would be told even as I did it. For example, not saying he said, she said, just giving us the dialogue and letting the dialogue identify the speakers. Using the first person plural, which I do through pretty much the whole thing, which felt fun and also right for this, because these girls, in a way, their identity is really a joint identity in their childhoods. And then, we start out with them loathing their father and him being sort of indifferent. And then the surprise I began to feel happening pretty quickly is that he is somehow beguiled by them. He gets curious about them. And it actually leads him ultimately into a pretty different approach to fatherhood than we've seen him have before with his other children.
He's beguiled by them because they're indifferent to him, and it's like an aphrodisiac or whatever the parental equivalent of that is, I think. So was what you just read among the things that you were working on on the tour for Goon Squad?
No, this I wrote later, probably like 2016, 17. I knew another reason that I wanted to revisit this world, let's say, of Goon Squad was that I knew certain things about people that the reader didn't know. So in Goon Squad, we hear very briefly, just in passing without names, that Lou Klein will have 2 more children and that one of them will take over his record company. That's it. And the very fact that there's so little there, it's so sparse and so meager as information, immediately is a challenge to me. It's sort of like Lou's children not giving him anything. That's not giving me anything. I have to get in there and find out deeply what that is. And in a way, it's all a study of perspective. You know, if someone says, my uncle died yesterday, you'd say, oh, I'm so sorry. It comes and it goes. But from another point of view, that's a devastating disaster full of infinite detail and drama and history and fireworks. And I love moving from the perspective from which it is just a line in passing to a perspective in which we're surrounded by it.
One of the effects that it creates, I think, is you also get this sense of, it's a way of building character almost, where I just think of it as like a building where you have floors of a character, like here's Lou with these daughters, here's Lou 10 years earlier, or I'm making that up, but on a plane with the previous daughter, and then you imagine here's Lou dying, here's Lou in the 60s, and then everything else in between is kind of dropped out. And it feels like, weirdly, like you've made some kind of discovery about how humans are, kind of, through that curiosity.
Well, and in a way, the machine in the middle of this book, which is not a new idea, a consciousness externalization machine, which if people share their consciousnesses, lets them actually view or experience the consciousnesses of other people. There's a chapter where one of Lou's children, one of the older ones, not these two, uses this machine, or uses the collective consciousness to actually to experience a day in her father's life from 1965, when she was only 6, from her father's point of view. So she, as him, goes to a marijuana farm in a kind of beatnik enclave of California in 1965, when most people were still wearing neckties and her father is a total square, and she watches him discover the very beginnings of the counterculture. And so we watch that too through her eyes. We're sort of in two people's minds at once. And what she discovers is basically why her parents' marriage ended. And she also discovers what she always sensed, which was that her father loved her brother a lot more than he loved her. And so it's that, curiosity, of course, can be having curiosity satisfied is not always a pleasant experience, as we all know.
Yeah. I think of like the fantasy of attending your own funeral or something like that. And it's like you would not actually want to be there and see what
Or reading your Amazon reviews.
Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
That's brutal.
So for those who haven't read the book, Goon Squad is basically, is being written in the early aughts, and it's using the techniques that you just discussed, but the world that it's building is kind of the already then fading world of like vinyl, rock and roll, the music industry, like New York, it's an important place, you got to make your music. And what I think you've done is take these characters, and maybe this is what you meant by sibling novel, which I'd love to hear about, and now we're kind of turning, Jana's face to look at the future and what's coming to replace that, and it's this kind of tech world. And one of the things that I really responded to in the reading, it would have been so easy, for example, if I had written it, for it to be this satirical, like, tech is bogus, there's nothing for us there. But you maintain that curiosity that you spoke about and are really, really open-minded towards what might be good and bad about it. How do you, was that kind of a on principle for you, or is that just kind of the way you look at this stuff?
I think I have many worries about technology, don't get me wrong, and I'm like a late and incompetent adopter of all things technological, but I think I would never have been drawn to include it. I guess it was appearing naturally in what I was writing, and I wouldn't have really rolled with that if I felt like a judgmental tone was asserting itself, because I personally just don't like that in fiction. I don't like being told what to think. And I also feel like, knocking technology, talk about a tired subject. We all know there are lots of potential problems with technology. So I think if I didn't feel like I had more excitement about what I could do with this, then I just wouldn't have maybe the book would never have happened. But instead, I was drawn to this device that I sort of invent in the book, which again is not new. It has appeared in other kinds of science fiction. I would have guessed that anyway, and I've been told it in no uncertain terms. But what I was excited
by
about...
readers and Q&As, I'm guessing.
There's apparently a Black Mirror episode that includes memory externalization. But to me, the fun of it was what it let me do narratively. So how else can I let a daughter experience a day in her father's life through his brain? Like, that's just fun. Or another thing I really wanted to do before I had come up with the machine, which came into focus kind of late, was I thought I really want to write something in which people can find people that they've glimpsed just once in their lives, or maybe more than once, but without enough identifying information to find them on social media. Just, again, that sort of a paucity of information and then wanting to get in there and know everything about that person. And I couldn't figure out how I could kind of earn the right to do that narratively. Like, what would be the world in which that would be possible? But with this device, I was able to do it. So there's a point where a guy named Miles Hollander, who falls into opioid addiction, ends up completely blowing up his life, and then cleans up, but ends up for a while as a pretty marginal figure. And in that period of marginality, he's consumed by curiosity about this guy named Damon who used to sell him drugs. And he starts to have these ideas that Damon must have really succeeded in his life. And he places a lot of hope on the idea that somehow Damon pulled himself together, and he even has fantasies that maybe Damon is like a politician or a governor, or a law firm partner, Miles having been expelled from his law firm as a result of his addiction. So he uses this product called Hey Whatever Happened To, in which you put electrodes on your head, you think hard about the person you want to learn about, you then release those particular memories into the collective, so those are now swirling around, and then with facial recognition, the product shows you what they call gray grabs, meaning anonymous snippets of other people's memories of that same person. And he's able, in 15 minutes, to watch Damon's life through these snippets of memory, from childhood to a troubled teenage period to ultimately to Miles's huge disappointment doing push-ups in Orange in a prison. So he's very disappointed, Damon.
A shocking twist for a drug dealer. Who would have thought?
Shocking only to Miles. But yeah, so it was really my own kind of sense of fun in storytelling that led me to even invent this device. So I guess I didn't have a downbeat feeling about it because it was serving me so incredibly well.
And then for the characters, I think what it does actually, because you handle it I think in science fiction, it would be very forward in the story. The story would be, hey, look at this technology. And in the novel, you just have people living their lives from 1965 really, but especially from 2010 to 2035, and it's there's this curtain, and behind it, these products are being invented, and they occasionally pop forward. But what it does in the novel, I think, is really, or what at least moved me about it, was the longing to find out about your drug dealer. You're like, that guy had a nice smile, and he made me feel good. Can I find out that he's doing okay? And you can't. Or there's another addict character, and you kind of depict her communing with the unconscious for the first time, and you're like, God, she just really wants to get out of her own skin. And it just pulls you into the character and their longings, and they're kind of chasing something that, whether the technology is good or bad, or it's not gonna ultimately scratch that itch.
Yeah, and that's Roxy, one of Lou's other children, who becomes a heroin addict and really can't pull herself out of it. And I guess there was a point that I wanted to write about someone actually using this technology and what it would feel like. So she wears the electrodes and externalizes her consciousness, and she feels this tremendous sense of lightness, as if some difficult weight or almost crowding inside her brain has been relieved. And I love that kind of body interaction with the technology. And there's another, almost a kind of echo of that in the very first chapter that I wrote, the one that I wrote on my book tour called Lulu the Spy, where Lulu, who's a peripheral character in Goon Squad, appears in her 30s, in 2032, working for the government undercover and spying on people who are plotting against America. And this is another, actually, a reason that I think I ended up in a world of technology, to your earlier question, which is that I constantly had to write about the future if I wanted to follow certain characters into their futures, because it's established when they're born or when they're young people. So I don't really have a choice but to go into the future. So with Lulu as a spy, it was so, I found myself thinking, well, wait a minute, she's posing as a beauty, essentially a sort of very high-level prostitute. And so the question was, how is she going to record these people she's spying on? And suddenly, because I was in the future, it felt easy to say, she has a camera inside her eye. She has a tape recorder inside her ear, and the whole story takes the form of little bulletins that she issues mentally, in the form of lessons learned. So I could have thought of that and just inserted it into the present, of course, but somehow the future, being forced into the future by the ages of characters, made me feel freer about approaching technology. And then once I'm in the realm of technology, it becomes really, because I'm always interested in sort of how things feel in the body, just as how it felt to Roxy to externalize her consciousness and share it to the collective. There's a moment where Lulu uploads the contents of one of her subjects' phones into her body through a portal between her toes. And there's a moment where she describes the feeling of the rush, the kind of gush of all of this information entering her physically, because she has to store it until it can be removed from her by the government. So I was always brought there for these very fundamental human reasons, and then enjoyed the kind of wild, dramatics I had a chance to write about as a result.
How did watching your boys, now collegians, I think, scholars and gentlemen, how did watching them kind of grow up through the, I guess we're in the post-Facebook, whatever. How did that, you mentioned it in the acknowledgments, that had somehow lured you into realms that were essential for this book.
So much. So one thing is, a beloved former babysitter, now friend of our family, is actually, I think, in the audience. So she will appreciate this, hopefully, which is that, yes, my kids were pretty young during the years that I was working on this, especially starting in 2010. They were only 9 and 7 then. And there are two big influences on this book that are a little related to each other that I would never have known much about if not for my kids, and those are baseball and Dungeons and Dragons. And those two undertakings might seem really different from each other, and they for sure are, but there are certain things they have in common, one of which is a kind of numerical undergirding. So although, a baseball game is obviously a dramatic encounter, or sometimes not that dramatic, encounter among a group of athletes with their own histories, and that's what makes it so much fun, it's also a very metrical sport that can be described using just numbers with an enormous amount of accuracy, or numbers and symbols. And likewise, Dungeons and Dragons is an ongoing adventure story in which creatures do all kinds of things, especially fight other creatures. And yet again, there's a numerical underpinning of all of it. Dice are an essential fixture of the game, because what people are like, or creatures are like, what their traits are and skills, and even every move they make is determined by rolls of the dice. So all of that got me thinking about our data fixated era, and the way in which that both does describe human behavior and doesn't at all, that humans remain so individual and so mysterious, even as we revere a statistical approach to human life. And I remember there was one time when my older son, the baseball player, I kept saying, why aren't you reading? Because I probably said that way too much. And he said, I am. And I said, well, no, that's just a book of statistics. And he said, and I said, I meant reading a story. And he said, I am reading a story. And he showed me how he narrated the story of a player's career using a rectangle full of that player's stats. And it was really moving. He showed me how this player does worse when he's traded, and look, he starts doing better here, and then he gets traded 3 times, and he can't get back, and then he's not getting much playing time. And I'm like, oh, you're right. Oh, that's terrible. And I realized that was a story. And actually that got me thinking, can I have a chapter in my book that is just a graph or a table? I didn't quite manage that, but I did put in a fair amount of phony algebra.
I think that it would have actually done violence to the book if you had managed to pull it off, because what you actually get, I'm trying to find, I have this note somewhere of the conversation between the coder. There's a coder named Lincoln, and he's bewitched by this woman at work, and he's trying to find the X that will solve the problem of her, and the X is an object. So I think he's going to Walmart and buying things. And then she's at his apartment, and he either gives her, she gets into the box, and it's the fact of all the objects and not any one X that turns out to be X. So it's it both is and isn't a problem that can be described mathematically. And then they have a little argument about that that's wonderful. And one of them says, it's random. I wish I'm not going to be able to, oh yeah, here it is. One of them says, a series of choices made by a particular person in a particular place could be diagrammed mathematically. And the other says, so can randomness after the fact. History is retroactive math. And the book is just right there in the middle, about this question of whether things, and that's what I meant about the openness to technology. But I was expecting you to say the realms were Facebook and Twitter that they lured you into, but it was Dungeons and Dragons and baseball. That is fascinating.
Oh yeah, no, because I guess we're kind of all on Twitter, and Twitter did inspire me. Twitter definitely inspired the chapter called Lulu the Spy. Back in 2010, I was thinking, this seems like a cool storytelling vehicle. How can I bend it to my purposes? But no, it was their kid activities. And in fact, there was a whole period where they would each have a group to our house. The baseball guys would play Stratomatic, which is a statistical baseball game that you play on paper, and the D&D kids would play D&D in the kitchen, and I would bake for everyone, and I would eavesdrop on the D&D players. And so often, we were talking earlier about parenthood and feeling like you're not getting anything done, and sometimes those afternoons I would think, God, I wish I didn't establish this tradition of always baking for them, because it really means that it uses up my afternoon. But in retrospect, I'm so glad I did, because all that eavesdropping really did serve me well later.
You're just paying them for research with brownies. It's perfect.
It's so true.
What was the scariest piece of this to write?
That's a good question. I'm not sure anything. I will tell you the one that was the hardest. It was the companion to Lulu the Spy. So Lulu has worked as a spy in a very genre-esque piece, and that was the first one I wrote. And I knew that in order to make that part of a book, which I was determined to do if there would be a book, I would have to find a way to see Lulu after she's back in her life as a regular person, because in the spy story, Lulu is almost like a genre character, and that was something that interested me specifically, the idea of actually seeing people in and out of different genres in this book. And so, for example, before we see Lulu as a spy, in this chapter that I wrote for Twitter, in which she's narrating her story in these mental bulletins in the form of lessons learned, we see her as a peripheral character, as the friend of a girl named Molly, in a chapter that is narrated as a stream of consciousness by a 13-year-old in a state of quasi-hysteria over being excluded and wanting to be popular. So it's in a way, it's a pretty self-conscious YA kind of story. It's really being in the head of a teenager. And Lulu is the friend from elsewhere who comes to the country club, and she and Molly kind of bond, and it ends up being a really big thing because everything is to Molly at that point. The next thing we see in terms of Lulu is Lulu in this very genre-esque spy story. But I knew that I had to find a way to see Lulu after that. And I tried so hard, I tried so many things, and I couldn't make anything work. At first I thought Lulu would be back at home, but she can't stop thinking in these little bulletins, and that's kind of driving her crazy. But I found that whereas writing in these short structural units felt freeing and kind of fun and funny when Lulu was a spy, it felt downbeat and really humorless and actually really constraining after she was home. So that was not a good sign. Then I thought, okay, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to write about Lulu from the point of view of her therapist in therapist notes. That didn't even make it to my writing group. It was so unsuccessful. And then finally, it was actually taking a really different tack, which was a much more kind of ensemble story that is told in the form of email. So it's an epistolary chapter that Lulu starts out trying to reconnect with a movie star she met as a child in A Visit from the Goon Squad, and that sets in motion a flurry of email correspondence or electronic communication of some kind in which everyone is trying to get something from everyone's trying to get something from people and without giving the thing, or giving enough of the thing that they've been asked for to get the thing they're trying to get, and it ends up being funny. And somehow humor was the thing I needed to make the aftermath of Lulu fun. But I was nervous because it took so long to get there, and there was so much failure along the way, and really easily 100 unsuccessful pages, and that is always a little scary.
I want to ask you one last question, short one, and then I think we'll take some questions from the audience. Whenever I see someone kneeling with a mic in hand, I go, okay, it's Q&A time. So well done. I was looking around, and I don't have my phone for the time. But I just wanted to ask you a parenthood question. Help me out. You've written what you've written, and you've raised kids, and I am in that boat. Do you have any? How do you make those two things work together, aside from brownies and eavesdropping?
I mean, I think that I always felt like I was getting. Well, first of all, you got 4 and I've got 2, so I can maybe tell you something half useful.
No one's keeping score.
I think could I have done it with 4? Maybe. So I think one thing is I always felt like I was getting nothing done, but I was usually getting more done than I thought. And so there was a kind of illusory sense that I couldn't work while having these kids, when in fact, in retrospect, it's sort of the perfect job, because you can do your work wherever you want and also be with kids, which I found to be great. And then I think the other side of it is, in a way, what I said, that a lot of time that felt like time away from work actually ended up being so useful. And, even things like, there was one low point for me as a human, I think, when I agreed to do live action role playing with one of my sons, meaning that we went to a place called Night Realms, which is a live action. Someone knows what this is.
It's almost certainly in New Jersey.
It's in New Jersey. It's at a former Girl Scout camp. And once a month, people from all walks of life come and assume an ongoing character, and they engage in role playing, and they are knights and creatures and lords and priests. And my son said he wanted to be a non-player character, meaning you're kind of a supporting cast to help enact all these dramas. And he said, "Mom, I really want you to experience this too." And I thought, oh my God. So I said, okay, I will also be an NPC. So my first role was as a distraught mother whose children have been eaten by a monster. And I had to run around this Girl Scout camp in the snow screaming for my children. And then weeping after it turns out that they've been devoured by a monster, one of them being my own son, who was covered with blood lying in the snow. And afterward, what Raoul had to say to me was, "Mom, you're really not a good actress."
Well, there's your next novel, so you owe him a tray of brownies. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Hi, can you hear me? This is a question for either or both of you. I'm a writer, and I'm sure you get the question all the time of, what would you recommend to an aspiring writer or whatever. I don't want to ask you the same question. I read once that Kafka had "wait" written in front of his desk. I was wondering if either or both of you have like a short phrase or something that you would put above your desk while you're writing. Thank you.
Well, someone in my writing group, and by the way, I dedicated this book to my writing group. They're so incredibly helpful to me. For a while, she would notice that whenever she really got deeply into what she was doing, she would get up and leave the room. She would sort of break her own concentration, so she put a sign over her door that said, "Why are you leaving?" And so I have that mental sign in my brain, and it accompanies me through things like picking up my phone, suddenly feeling I need to know something, and I will picture that sign, "Why are you leaving?" So it's, in a way, it's not so much a guidance in doing the work as a warning not to interrupt my concentration.
That's great advice. My version of that sign said "ass in the chair."
Hi, great program tonight, first of all, but I have a kind of a two-part question. One is really easy. How many times do you read your draft before it goes off to publish? And the other one is, when you were growing up and going to school or whatever, were you drawn to classes in psychology or anthropology? I know you're a storyteller, but to create these characters, you have to wonder how did any of those other things call out to you? Thanks.
I wanted to be an archaeologist for a really long time, and I think what I loved about archaeology was something that was purely imaginary. In fact, I discovered this in month 1 of my gap year when I paid to go on a short archaeological dig in Campsville, Illinois, and found that I actually didn't like it very much. But what I had imagined was digging into the earth with a shovel and plucking out beautiful vases and tools and artifacts of human life that would let me just sort of bathe in a nostalgic sense of what life had been for other people at other times. And as soon as I found myself on a square meter of earth in 99-degree heat, squatting with a scalpel, I realized that that wasn't really how archaeology works. And later, it seemed to me that it was all really a metaphor for fiction writing. So yes, I still love anthropology. There's an anthropologist in, the girl's mother in this story that I read is an anthropologist. In terms of drafts, that is really, I'm glad you asked that question because I mentioned the improvisational way that I start, but I sometimes forget to mention the several years of relentless editing and outline making that follows that improv. So that the improv is just material gathering, and then I number my drafts, which is easy to do since I usually do edit by hand on hard copies. With any chapter, it's going to be around 35 or 36 drafts in the end. But with some books of mine, like Look at Me, there are sections where I got up to 70. So a lot of drafts. That, in a way, sounds more dramatic than it is, because if you think about looking at a screen and editing continuously, and if you count each one of those passes as a draft, they add up pretty quickly. But for me, rewriting is where the writing actually gets good, hopefully. The improv is where I get ahead of my conscious mind and actually come up with some good ideas.
Hello. Critics have put your book, particularly Goon Squad, I think, in the category of postmodern. Is that a label that you embrace or resist?
Well, it's a good question. To me, I think, it's postmodern to me is an academic label, and as such, I think my work might meet the definition of it. But for fiction, I find the term postmodern a bit alienating because it sounds abstract and kind of honestly potentially dull and sort of academic, and maybe a book that's more about ideas than people, and that's exactly the opposite of the kind of fiction I want to read and the kind of fiction I want to write. So I think when people describe my books as postmodern, I think that might be an accurate description for academics, but I think it really gives the wrong impression to readers, because in the end, all I care about, and I'm not kidding, is that it be fun. When I'm in my writing group, the only thing I want to know is, where is it slow? Where is it alive? Where do you care? Where don't you? It's always about people and what they do, and if we don't care, then there's no reason to read it. So in a literary context, I don't think that the word postmodern is so helpful. And I just want to mention we have a question up here too when the time comes.
Okay, hi. I'm always curious about writers and their process, and you mentioned outline. So I'm wondering if you know it doesn't sound like with this book you did, but other books, do you know the beginning, middle, end? One writer said that she knows the end sentence before she starts writing. So I'm just curious, what is your process, and especially with the outlining?
I really don't know the end. In fact, I really don't know much beyond the beginning when I start, and that is intentional. And the reason is that anything I could think of for an end at an early point would not be interesting enough. It would be too much like what someone else might think. So what I'm looking for in that messy beginning, and for Manhattan Beach, we're talking 28 legal pads full of handwriting over the course of a year and a half before I even typed it. So in a way, I paid dearly for this process in time, aggravation, and eye strain trying to read my own handwriting and type it up. What I get is hopefully some fun, surprising stuff that I couldn't have thought of. And so I really don't know if I can see the end, then that better not be the end. That better be the end that it isn't. So I'm always trying to avoid the obvious ideas, which are the ideas I have, and find what I couldn't have thought of, which are the better solutions. Once I think I have all of that, then an outline helps me take ownership of it and try to work into it with much more care, precision, and hopefully beauty somewhere along the way. But the big moves are really spontaneous, and they come without my plan.
You're sort of into a continuum. You've hooked up 2 books where the characters come and go. Are you tempted to be seduced into finding characters in your latest book that are minor, that might become major in another book?
Well, you mean would I want to expand this world into 3? I am curious. There are some people I'm curious about, and there are some forms I'd like to try. So the curiosity is definitely still there. There are other things I really want to do first, actually. So this would, I think, again, there would be a long gap. And part of that is I love to try to work against what I've just done. So, and that's just for fun, honestly. But, this book is more fragmentary. It's very contemporary. There's a lot of technology. And I find myself really interested right now in detectives in the 1950s, let's say. So I like to move around. I really want to write a book set in 19th century New York, and I'm thinking really hard about how to do that. When I worked on Manhattan Beach, it was so hard. It required so much research, and I felt so outside my comfort zone that I frequently thought, if I can just do this once, I'll never try it again. But in the end, I found myself, the rewards were so rich. I feel like it woke up the city of New York for me. And I love the thought of doing more historical fiction. So we'll see. I think I'll keep noodling around and letting my curiosity guide me in the world of these people, but I don't feel pressured. I would only create another book if I thought it were its own thing and as good as the other two with its own set of concerns. So we'll see.
Thank you. First of all, my book club loved your book last night. You answered a lot of the questions I had. When we were reading it, we felt that there was a lot of short stories, and they were interwoven together. Was that your intent?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the way both books are constructed. I mean, and I guess I had slightly different cultural frames in mind. With A Visit from the Goon Squad, I was thinking about a concept album, which is a big story. And of course, I grew up in the 1970s, which I do think was the great era of concept albums. Others may disagree. But a big story told in small pieces that sound really different from each other and kind of get something that are all enriched by the abrasion of those different sounds. And I think with The Candy House, I thought of it more as a kind of, let's say, a game in which we move in and out of different worlds that have different textures and qualities to them. But in a way, those are just metaphors for the same thing, which is a book constructed in pieces that are very unlike and yet fuse into a larger story. So yes, absolutely.
What was your favorite character that you felt that you got satisfaction by the end of the stories?
Well, you know, I have to really love them all, honestly, because I think it's the job. I mean, empathy has to be not only present but foremost, I think, when writing fiction, because, you know, I'm not an autofiction person at all. I don't write about my own life. I find it dull. I'm interested in discovering other lives and worlds, and the fun of it is actually being lifted out of my own life. The farther I am from me, the happier I feel. And so, you know, when I'm writing about people like Lou Klein, the father of these little girls, or a guy named Alfred in another part of the book who is so desperate for authenticity that he takes up screaming bloody murder in public just to experience the authentic reactions of people around him. Okay, that's a pretty alienating thing to do, and it's also really extreme and unimaginable for someone like me. I'm the one who's trying to normalize everything. But, you know, the further I get from my own experience, the more necessary it is that I make the choices of that person feel not just logical to the reader, but essential. Like, we have to know why this must be the way it is. So it's hard to pick a favorite. I guess it's the most fun to do that in situations that are the most outrageous. And Lou, back to the dad that I read about here, is such a problematic guy that finding his humanity and looking at him from so many angles is something that I clearly have really enjoyed, because he's really the only major character from Goon Squad who's also a major character here.
Yeah, hi. Jennifer, you do books, fiction that's really socially relevant, as do you, Garth. And my question is, at this historical moment, for a lot of reasons, could use some narratives that, you know, move the culture, get it unstuck. I'm wondering if you think there's a chance for something on a low level of, say, Uncle Tom's Cabin or The Jungle or 1984 to do that. And I'm thinking of one book of the moment that Roe versus Wade comes out, Mercy Street, which is a really good book about abortion, which is a topic I'd have never thought could be that, I don't know, universal. I think she did a great job. So I'm just wondering what you both think.
You want to answer that first? I'm happy to.
I mean, I think the question is basically like, what, you know, can fiction move the needle on the culture? And I mean, I feel like I would be a traitor to our team if I said no. I mean, that's why. But I do think that we're one of the fastest of the technologies that we're all relating to everything from 30,000 feet, and being much less liable to like go out and do something for one other person. So I do think the change that happens through fiction tends to be, I read your book and my eyes are like a little more open, and then I see one other person who I realize needs something that I didn't know before, and I can do that, and it kind of spreads the grassroots thing rather than necessarily the muckraking that the scales will fall from their eyes and we'll all wake up and do the right thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. I mean, I love the thought that fiction can do that, and one of the kind of surprising rewards for me of writing The Candy House, which is about technology that you could see as dystopian and was written in a time that I found somewhat dystopian, 2016 onward, right through the pandemic. What I found myself, what I read from the book actually, and realized thereby that I think, is that I have so much faith in human beings actually, in human invention, ingenuity, ability to work together, actual generosity amidst, of course, also selfishness. So I guess, but the question is whether a book can have the power of something like Uncle Tom's Cabin. I think what's hard about it now is that we are so fragmented and honestly not as much of a reading culture, or not necessarily reading the same things. I mean, so much of our division is attributable to that. We're reading different realities, actually. So what can cut through all that? It's a really tall order. I don't know. But I will say that empathy, I think, is the tool that we all need for sure. The ability to actually try to see something from an opposite point of view. That is the fiction writer's job. And I think in a way it's the fiction reader's job. And I think that to the degree that we can get better at that, we can have a better chance of actually listening to and hearing each other. And that is a crucial that is a necessity for us right now. But I guess it would be naive to think a book is going to do that. I tend to think everyone needs to be an English major again, and that'll solve all the world's problems.
Hear, hear.